Some crimes begin not with a scream, but with a whisper behind a locked door, and the quiet gleam of a candelabra no one remembers lighting. In this tale, deception blooms like an orchid in shadow, and justice arrives wearing a reluctant handshake. Secrets flicker, lies decay, and somewhere in the silence, something refuses to shine. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. If you've never heard a grown woman in a designer mink accuse a lamp of eyeballing her, then you've never met Miss Lenora Vale, Broadway royalty, 3-time Tony nominee, and 1-time gossip column regular for a champagne glass throwing incident involving a stage director and an unpaid mink bill. Not that I'm judging. I happen to respect people who throw things with accuracy. She checked into the Hotel Lucerne, which caters to people with reputations, bank accounts, or at least publicists, late on a drizzly Tuesday night. Room 6, top floor, antique fixtures, and allegedly a charming view of the Hudson. What it had instead, apparently, was an antique candelabra and a serious attitude problem. By morning, Lenora had stormed into the lobby in sunglasses and a silken foul mood, demanding the manager with enough force to short out the elevator. According to the bellhop, who I later discovered couldn't hold on to a secret any better than he could his poker money, she declared, and I quote, "That thing stared at me all night." The thing, as it turned out, was a 2-foot brass candelabra with frilly scrollwork and 3 fake wax sleeves for bulbs. Not exactly Orwellian, but Miss Vale insisted that every time she turned off the lights, one of the bulbs glowed faintly, and she could feel it watching. Now, I've heard some tall tales in my day, but even I wouldn't have guessed this one would lead to murder. And I certainly didn't expect to hear about it over a bottle of Remmers on a Wednesday evening in Wolfe's office, with Fritz hovering in the doorway like something smelled overcooked, which it wasn't. The manager in question was one Dwight Penwell, a man with the nervous grace of a cat walking a banister over a snake pit. He wore pinstripes too tight for his shoulders and a moustache too thin for his upper lip, and he looked like he shaved twice a day out of obligation, not hair growth. Faced with Lenora Vale's diva-level theatrics and a potentially scandalous lamp, Penwell did what most hotel managers in his position would. He panicked, quietly but thoroughly. His first instinct wasn't to call the police. No, sir. His first instinct was to call maintenance. Enter the discreet electrician. Name was Don, with no last name given and none asked. He was one of those union types who always looked like he had somewhere better to be, and probably did. Penwell led him to room 6 with the care of a man guiding a surgeon toward a tumour. According to Penwell, Lenora had stormed out with enough perfume in the air to trigger smoke detectors. Don inspected the candelabra with a practiced eye, tapped the base, unscrewed one of the hollow arms, and muttered something low and not suitable for lobby ears. Then he pulled out a piece of something shiny, a lens, circular, perfectly set into the brass frame. And not the kind you find at the bottom of reading glasses. Penwell stopped blinking entirely. "Is that standard?" Penwell asked, as though spyware hidden in vintage lighting was a service offered by the concierge. Don gave him a look, usually reserved for men who ask whether electrical sockets can catch feelings. He turned the lens over in his gloved hand and said, "This ain't hotel issue, and it ain't just glass. This is optical grade, tight focal length, maybe a wide-angle feed. Could be wired, could be infrared." That's when Penwell turned a shade best described as alabaster in distress. While Don dug deeper into the wiring with the patience of a man paid hourly, Penwell began calculating column inches. A Broadway star, a room with a spying lamp, and an assistant prone to Instagram. That kind of thing doesn't just blow over, it headlines. And headlines don't mix well with rich guests, stockholders, or his bonus. By noon, Lenora Vale had been quietly upgraded to a private suite with blackout curtains, no visible candelabras, and enough complimentary champagne to sedate a publicity crisis. Meanwhile, the infamous Room 6 stood locked, dim, and disturbingly quiet. Except, of course, for the camera still staring from the floral centerpiece. But no one had noticed that yet. Mandy Horn was one of those assistants you barely noticed, which, in that line of work, is a resume builder. Slim, soft-spoken, a penchant for spiral notebooks and travel-sized lint rollers. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when she did, it was usually to ask if Miss Vale preferred lemon or lime in her water. Word from the Bell staff was that she kept a rigid schedule and didn't so much walk as glide. That made her sudden disappearance all the more jarring. By Wednesday morning, Mandy was gone. Her bed in the adjoining suite had been slept in, but her travel bag, a nondescript grey canvas number with a faded Amtrak tag, was nowhere to be found. Neither was her phone, her notebook, or her prescription glasses. The hotel's front desk claimed she'd walked out around 12:17 a.m., coffee in hand, and never returned. No coat, no umbrella, just a knit sweater and an over-the-shoulder bag, the kind that holds a wallet, maybe a paperback, maybe evidence. Penwell, to his credit, didn't immediately assume the worst. He assumed something far more dangerous to his position, a press leak. He ordered the staff to keep it quiet, told housekeeping to hold the room, and asked the security team to start pulling the hallway footage. Meanwhile, he left 4 voicemails for Mandy that started with "just checking in" and ended with "call me now." By lunchtime, the tone in the Lucerne's back hallways had shifted from confusion to concern. And by sundown, Room 6 wasn't just quiet, it was sealed. The security office at the Hotel Lucerne had 3 screens, one overworked night manager, and a habit of labeling hard drives with masking tape. It wasn't exactly the Pentagon, but it had enough footage to make someone uncomfortable, especially if they'd been in Room 6 with intent. The footage showed Mandy exiting the suite at precisely 12:17 a.m., heading toward the elevator. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look scared. She just looked thoughtful, like she had remembered something and wanted to clear it up before morning, the kind of thoughtful that gets people killed in the 3rd act. 3 minutes later, the hallway camera captured a different figure. Tall, male, in a dark coat and hat, entering Room 6 with a key. The timestamp read 12:20. The problem? No one was supposed to have a key. Not then. Penwell watched that part twice, then asked security to roll it back again. Slower. When the frame paused on the moment the man turned slightly toward the camera, something about the jawline looked familiar. But grainy footage and late nights don't make for confident IDs. That was when Penwell did something unexpected for a man whose life revolved around not attracting attention. He reached for his Rolodex, skipped over legal, and dialed a number listed under a single name. Wolfe, N. And at 9:04 a.m. the next day, the phone rang at 35th Street. I picked it up on the second ring, mostly because Fritz was elbow-deep in lemon pepper duck prep, and Wolfe had declared the morning intolerable before his second cup of coffee had cooled. The voice on the line was polite, male, and visibly sweating through the earpiece. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "this is Dwight Penwell. I'm the general manager at the Hotel Lucerne. I'd like to retain Mr. Wolfe's services for a matter that requires absolute discretion." I told him we didn't do late checkouts or broken sink warranties. He didn't laugh. "Something has happened," he said, "in one of our rooms. Something odd, possibly criminal, possibly not. But it involves a missing person and what appears to be surveillance equipment inside a historical fixture." That got Wolfe's attention. 10 minutes later, I was in the office with Penwell on speakerphone, and Wolfe was leaning back in his chair like a philosopher contemplating a troublesome syllogism. "The room, sir?" Wolfe asked. "Room 6, top floor, occupied by Miss Lenora Vale." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "The actress?" "Yes, but the matter concerns her assistant." Wolfe pressed his fingertips together. "And the police?" "Not yet." "Wise or cowardly?" "Possibly both." "I accept the case," Wolfe said, "on the strict condition that no further concealment occurs. You will make available all footage, all keys, all staff names, and any record of prior guests within a 12-week window." Penwell didn't hesitate. "Agreed." Wolfe hung up, turned to me and said, "Archie, bring your suit. We are going to investigate a light that never should have glowed." If you ever meet a man whose handshake feels like a sponsorship deal, you've probably just met Cal Griffin. He was tall, smooth-faced, and sported a tan summer-weight suit that made me suspect he ironed his shoelaces. He introduced himself as the Director of Public Relations for the Hotel Lucerne, which, judging by his expression, he considered more prestigious than the United Nations. I showed him into the office and offered him one of the client chairs, which he took like he expected it to recline. Then he reached into his pocket and slid a thick white envelope across Wolfe's desk, like he was placing a side bet. "I was advised," Griffin said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "that discretion is part of the Wolfe brand." Wolfe gave the envelope a glance, then returned his gaze to Griffin, as if he were observing a beetle with delusions of grandeur. "Mr. Griffin," Wolfe said, "if you are here to sell us branding advice, I shall be forced to call Mr. Goodwin's barber, who is better equipped to handle inflation of the scalp." Griffin cleared his throat. "It's about a situation at the Lucerne. A discreet inquiry. Room 6. A guest complained. A minor issue involving a light fixture. We'd like to understand what's going on before anyone else does." That was the first clue the man wasn't just slick. He was sweating under it. I filed him under charming with a secret and waited for Wolfe's verdict. It didn't take long. "I do not make vague inquiries," Wolfe said, lacing his fingers together. "I do not chase whispers, and I do not tolerate clients who offer envelopes before questions." Griffin squirmed. "I'm trying to get ahead of a situation. There's a chance a surveillance device was discovered. An actress was involved. Her assistant is currently missing." That earned him Wolfe's full attention. "Names?" Wolfe demanded. "Miss Lenora Vale." "And the assistant?" "Mandy Horn." I could practically feel Wolfe's muscles tense under his considerable weight. Not from surprise, from recognition. Wolfe never read the tabloids, but he had an uncanny memory for obscure playbills and the people behind them. "I accept," Wolfe said, "but on these conditions. You will not speak to the press. You will not lie to me again. And you will deliver any object removed from that room directly into my possession." Griffin nodded, but I could see his teeth clench through his lips. Whatever he was hiding, it didn't smell like missing person. It smelled like exposure. And while Wolfe launched into questions about room access and hotel blueprints, I leaned back in my chair and took a slow inhale of Griffin's cologne. It was called Contingency. I made a mental note to throw out my bottle. We had barely gotten to the part about the Candelabra's wiring when Fritz came in holding the phone like it was an undercooked liver. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. "Lon Cohen. He says it's urgent." Wolfe waved me off with a grunt. I took the call in the hall. "Archie," Lon said, "get this. Mandy Horn, the missing assistant. She's not missing anymore. Alive or dead? Dead. Found half an hour ago in a laundry chute at the Lucerne. Maintenance smelled something sour behind the linen carts. NYPD's already on the scene." I didn't ask what kind of shape she was in. You don't get found in a hotel laundry chute smelling like death and walk away with bruises and a memoir deal. When I came back into the office, Wolfe didn't look up from his notebook. Well, Mandy's been located, I said, in the laundry system. Unfortunately, she wasn't carrying a towel. Griffin's face did something interesting. A flicker of actual emotion. It might have been surprise. Might have been calculation. Either way, he leaned forward like someone just tightened the vice. Wolfe closed his notebook slowly. "Mr. Griffin," he said, "you are now a client with a corpse attached. Sit still." The doorbell rang like someone was jabbing it with a warrant. Before Fritz could get there, the front door swung open with the grace of a bull at a hat shop. Inspector Kramer marched in, followed by two uniforms who looked like they were there for furniture removal. "Well, blast it, Wolfe," Kramer growled. "You couldn't wait 30 minutes before mucking up my crime scene." "I have not moved a muscle outside this room," Wolfe replied without standing. "Nor have I interfered with your jurisdiction, though you are, regrettably, interfering with mine." Kramer turned to me. "What's he got to do with room 6? I nodded toward Griffin. "Our client, sort of. Cal Griffin, Hotel Lucerne. Came asking about some glass in a candelabra. Then Lon called." Kramer turned to Griffin with a face like someone had swapped his scotch for vinegar. "And you decided to hire him instead of calling me?" Griffin licked his lips. "I didn't want headlines. You're getting chalk outlines." The tension in the room could have bent forks. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "If you're finished asserting authority, Inspector, may we proceed with facts?" Kramer grunted, but stayed. When he crossed his arms, I noticed one hand was resting near his holster, just in case truth wasn't the only thing about to be drawn. With all eyes on him and sweat collecting at the base of his hairline, Griffin finally pulled the envelope from his briefcase and opened it. From inside, wrapped in a silk handkerchief like it had come from Tiffany's, he drew out a metal tube about 3 inches long, brass fittings on both ends, and a circular lens in the middle. "This," he said, "was embedded in the candelabra. One of our electricians removed it. We didn't want to call it what it looked like until we had context." Wolfe took it delicately, held it to the light, then reached for his magnifier. The silence in the room was thick enough to chew. After 2 minutes of close inspection, Wolfe said, "This is not a child's prank, nor a voyeur's toy. This is a professional surveillance device, wide-angle aperture, calibrated focus ring, military or government grade." Kramer's jaw ticked. "You saying this was planted?" Wolfe looked up. "I am saying it was not bought at a hobby store." Griffin shifted in his chair. "So someone was being watched?" "Yes," Wolfe said. "The question, Mr. Griffin, is who, and by whom. And now, also, why your assistant died to keep it hidden." The lens sat on Wolfe's desk like a silent witness, and it was beginning to talk. Kramer let out a breath through his nose that could have blown out a pilot light. "I want that lens logged as evidence." Wolfe shook his head. "No. You may have a photograph, but the item remains here for analysis." "You interfering again, Wolfe?" "No. I am correcting the pace at which your investigation stumbles." Kramer stepped forward, but I intervened with my most charming grin and a shoulder square that meant I wasn't moving unless shoved, and even then it had cost bruises. Wolfe ignored us both. "This lens," he said, "was installed with precision, not improvisation. Someone knew Room 6's decor well enough to disguise it. That takes time, resources, and intent. Miss Horn stumbled into it. Whether by accident or knowledge, we do not yet know." He turned to me. "Archie, go to the Lucerne. Bring me a full list of suite assignments, staff duty logs, and security access cards. I want the entire hotel on my desk before lunch." Kramer growled. You treating this like war? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Worse. This is theatre, and someone rewrote the script with blood. I grabbed my coat. The curtain, as they say, was only beginning to rise. I checked into the Hotel Lucerne under the name J. Havermeyer, a traveling furniture buyer from Cincinnati. It wasn't my most dazzling alias, but it got me a room, a smile from the front desk girl, and access to the real star of the day, room 6. A modest tip and some muttered sympathy about a client who hated bad feng shui got the bell captain to swing the door open without raising eyebrows. I stepped inside and immediately felt the kind of discomfort you usually get in doctors' waiting rooms or first marriages. The air was thick with citrus polish, lemon oil heavy enough to strip paint and maybe a conscience or two, but beneath that there was a sharper note, not quite fear, call it unease, still trapped between the drapes. The infamous candelabra sat dead center on the antique sideboard, no bulbs lit, no lens gleaming. But a closer inspection showed tiny gouges at the base of the central arm, the kind you get when someone pries brass apart with surgical enthusiasm. Someone had done some rewiring, and judging by the scratches on the floor and the scuff on the wardrobe hinge, Room 6 had recently played host to someone more interested in access than aesthetics. I left my suitcase behind and went in search of a bellhop with loose lips and possibly looser morals. Vince, the night bellhop, had the haircut of a man who bet on horses and the breath of one who lost. I found him outside the service exit during his smoke break, lighting a Camel with hands that twitched like he was rolling imaginary dice. I introduced myself as Havermeyer, the furniture buyer, but it took exactly 12 seconds, and a 20 in palm, to shift the conversation to more interesting topics. "Mandy?" he said, eyes flicking up at the surveillance camera over the alley door. "Yeah, I saw her that night. Real quiet type, but she looked jumpy, kept checking her phone, pacing near the elevators like she was waiting for someone who wasn't showing." "Did she say anything?" I asked. "Nah, just nodded at me. Told me not to tell Miss Vale she went out." He flicked his ash, looked around. "But she wasn't the only one." I tilted my head. "No?" He leaned closer. "About 20 minutes after she left, I saw a guy come down the hall and use a key on room 6. Not tall, stocky, dressed like a concierge, but not one of ours." "You sure it wasn't a guest?" Vince scoffed. "Guests don't slip cash to staff for silence, and this guy smelled like money, and something else." "What else?" He stubbed out his cigarette. "Fear." I left him pocketing the 20 and humming to himself like he'd just rolled a 7, but his last sentence stuck like a burr in a sock. Fear doesn't usually walk around with keys to other people's rooms. Carlotta, the morning chambermaid, had a voice like gravel and a talent for gossip that deserved a pension plan. She met me outside the linen closet on the 7th floor and lit up when I said I was helping the hotel discreetly sort a misunderstanding. "Oh, honey," she said, pulling her cart closer. "You mean that room 6 mess?" "Tell me everything," I replied. "But don't spill the softener." She snorted. "The room wasn't even supposed to be for Miss Vale. The schedule got switched the night before. I remember because I'd already put in the turn-down mints and everything. Then Mr. Penwell called, said, swap the bookings." "Any idea who had it before?" She squinted at the ceiling. "Some Mr. Vance. Sounded British or something. But then he was gone. And Miss Vale was in." "And why the switch?" She gave a coy shrug. "Maybe someone didn't want Vance near that room. Or maybe someone wanted her instead." "Was that your own guess?" I asked. She winked. "That's Carlotta's rule of swapped sheets. Whenever they change rooms last minute, someone's afraid of what's waiting there. That rule wasn't in any maid handbook I'd seen, but I wasn't going to argue with someone who folded towels like confessions. If you ever want to meet a man who makes divorce lawyers look like kindergarten volunteers, you should try lunch with Lawrence Peake. The man had the charm of a molar extraction and the personal warmth of a jury summons. Fortunately for me, his assistant owed me a favor from a different case involving a missing costume, a stagehand, and a pair of leopard print opera gloves. Don't ask. Peake's office was somewhere between over-designed and under-lived in, all chrome and shadow, like a theatre that forgot to open. He sat behind a desk large enough to host a séance and made no effort to stand when I came in. "You're here for Lenora," he said flatly. "I'm here for clarity," I said, which I imagine is hard to come by in divorce settlements. He grunted. "Ask your question." So I did. Where he was the night Mandy Horn vanished, what he knew about room 6, and whether or not he was in the habit of switching out light fixtures in his ex-wife's hotel suite. He claimed he was home all night, rehearsing a table read with a playwright and a paralegal. He said he hadn't spoken to Lenora in 3 months, and that Mandy Horn was some mousy dresser girl he barely remembered from backstage 2 seasons ago. But when I mentioned that Mandy was now dead, found in a laundry chute, he shifted, just slightly. His hand went to his jacket, then to the edge of the desk. "Awful," he said, after a pause a beat too long. "But not my problem." I left him staring into the reflection of his own lye-polished credenza. Broadway backstage rooms smell like sweat, hairspray, and regret. I know, because I spent a decent portion of my 20s in them, chasing rumors, dodging scenery, and once eating a tuna sandwich in a dressing room next to a taxidermied swan. But that's another story. This time I was after Clea Morgan, Lenora Vale's understudy in The Mad Woman of Millbrook. Tall, red-haired, and sharp enough to slice onions by smiling, Clea greeted me with all the enthusiasm of a cold encore. "You from the press?" she asked, applying lipstick without a mirror. "Private investigator." "Worse." I told her I was looking into Miss Vale's recent hotel debacle, specifically room 6. She rolled her eyes so hard I could hear the orbit. "Lenora always needs a stage, even when she's not on one. I wouldn't be surprised if she rigged the whole staring Candelabra bit just to get her name back in page 6. When I asked about Mandy, her expression went blank. Mandy who? Horn, her assistant, now deceased. She blinked once. "Never met her. Don't know the room. I don't do hotels. I sleep where I rehearse." It wasn't a denial, more like a defense mechanism. But it didn't feel like guilt. It felt like bitterness. The kind that builds when someone else gets the spotlight and you're left holding their coat. Getting an interview with Lenora Vale was like scheduling tea with Cleopatra, possible in theory, but complicated by mood, weather, and personal drama. But with Mandy dead, and Wolfe's involvement no longer theoretical, she finally agreed to meet me in her suite. A 3-room number with too many mirrors and not enough truth. She greeted me in silk and shadows, swirling a goblet of something white and imported, and settled onto the fainting couch like it was opening night. "You're Mr. Goodwin," she purred, the one with the eyebrows and the unfortunate reputation for skepticism. "Guilty," I said, "though the eyebrows are innocent." I asked her about room 6, about the switch, about Mandy. She played coy for 3 answers, then defensive for 2 more, and finally landed on the performance she'd clearly rehearsed. "Mandy was just a girl from wardrobe," she said, eyes wide with tragic disbelief. She fetched me mineral water and kept my scarf steamed. I don't know why she would leave, or what she would know. "Did you feel watched in that room?" She hesitated. Yes and no. But it wasn't that thing. It was something else. What? She touched her temple. A presence. Or perhaps just nerves. Wolfe, when I relayed that later, called it what it was: selective hysteria with defensive polish. By the time I stepped back into Wolfe's office, Fritz had laid out cold lamb slices, cress salad, and a pitcher of Wolfe's second favorite beer. I didn't touch a bite, not because I wasn't hungry, but because Wolfe's look said the real meal was about to begin. I gave him the rundown. Carlotta's guest swap, Vince's twitchy bellhop account, the producer with a grudge, the co-star with an axe in her purse, and Miss Vale herself. Equal parts panic and performance. He listened with his eyes closed and his lips pursed like a man chewing a bitter olive. When I finished, I handed him the photo I'd swiped from the Lucerne's booking file. Julian Vance. Passport renewal, dated 2 years back. Beside it, I jotted down, British diplomat, retired. Allegedly room 6's original guest. Wolfe opened his eyes, studied the photo, and nodded once. Thank you, Archie. You already figured it out. Not entirely, but I have now confirmed the fulcrum. The question is not who watched Miss Vale. The question is, who was meant to be watched? He leaned back. And what Miss Horne saw, that got her killed. Wolfe was at his desk, rolling a maraschino cherry across a notepad like it had personally insulted his palate when I returned from the Lucerne with the hotel's reservation log. I dropped it onto the desk like an overdue confession. Mr. Penwell was kind enough to share the full booking index, I said. Room 6 was reserved 3 weeks prior by one Julian Vance, retired diplomat, current ghost guest. Ghost guest? Wolfe arched a brow. He never checked in, cancelled 2 days before the incident. Penwell said he didn't think much of it, thought maybe the room change was corporate juggling. Wolfe plucked the top page from the folder and stared at the name as if it had committed a grammatical error. Julian Emery Vance, he read aloud. Former UN attaché to Geneva, retired from diplomatic service after the Berlin Accord fallout. Specialty in Cold War arbitration. I nodded. Now lives in a ritzy co-op on East 72nd, name still on the buzzer. Wolfe exhaled. A Cold War specialist who booked the exact room that later hosted surveillance-grade opticals. Suspicion is not a luxury, Archie. It is a necessity. That's when I knew what my next stop was. I grabbed my hat, checked my shoes, and went uptown to visit a man who'd backed away from international intrigue, but apparently not far enough. Julian Vance answered his door like a man who regretted installing a doorbell. He was pale, lean, and groomed with the kind of meticulousness usually reserved for court appearances or funerals. He wore a grey cardigan, loafers, and an expression that said his tolerance for uninvited guests had eroded sometime during the Nixon administration. I'm Archie Goodwin, I said, showing my card. I'm investigating an incident at the Hotel Lucerne, room 6. His eyes didn't blink. I cancelled that reservation. Yes, sir. Curious timing, though. You'd booked it for last Thursday through Saturday. Miss Lenora Vale got it instead. Something happened while she was there. Something? A hidden camera, built into the candelabra. Now he blinked, then swallowed. Interesting, he said, like someone pretending not to have just swallowed a live bee. I wasn't aware. May I come in? He hesitated just long enough to make me think he'd say no. Then he stepped back, with the grace of a man who didn't want to touch the doorknob twice. Inside, the co-op was all antique rugs and dull wood, clean but too symmetrical, like a stage set for a diplomat who'd forgotten he was off duty. I changed my travel plans, he said, voice neutral. Family matter. Out of town? Yes, for 3 days. Anyone confirm that? Why would anyone need to? He smiled, but it didn't touch his jaw, and from where I stood, that jaw was trembling. The tea was lukewarm and the hospitality was arctic. Vance poured 2 cups of something vaguely herbal and offered me one with a hand that didn't shake, but didn't rest either. His fingers hovered on the rim, like he wasn't sure whether to serve or shield. "So," I said, "how long have you lived here?" He answered with the number of years, but not the memories. It was the kind of reply that comes from a man who's never really unpacked. I took a sip. Weak tea, sharp edge. Probably the same blend he used when negotiating with French diplomats in the 60s. Across from me, on a low, lacquered shelf, sat a brass incense burner, recently used. A curl of black ash clung to the inside, and the room smelled faintly of something spicy and sour, cloaking incense, good for masking odours, or anxiety. Vance lifted his cup and winced, not from taste, but heat. His tongue darted out as if he'd burned it recently, and I don't mean just now. "You use that burner often?" I asked. He looked down. "Occasionally. Helps me think." "Smoke out the thoughts, huh?" He smiled again, thinner this time. "Or the watchers." I didn't write that down. I didn't have to. After 15 more minutes of talking in measured tones about nothing in particular, including a rambling anecdote about a pastry chef in Madrid and a misfired toaster, Vance checked his wristwatch, which I'm fairly certain hadn't ticked in a decade. "I'm afraid I have a call scheduled," he said, rising with the stiffness of someone rehearsing a courtroom exit. I finished my tea, which now tasted more like confession than chamomile. "Thanks for the time," I said, pocketing the mental notes I'd collected. "One last question. You ever meet Mandy Horn?" He froze, barely perceptible, like an old film reel catching a frame. "No," he said slowly. "Should I have?" "She worked for Miss Vale." "I know who she is," he replied too quickly. "Was. But no, we never met." He moved toward the door with more energy than grace, opened it, and practically guided me out with an apologetic nod. The lock clicked the moment I hit the hallway. I called Wolfe from a payphone 2 blocks down, told him everything, the tea, the incense, the sweat under the surface. Wolfe listened and said, "He is not lying well. That's because he's scared." "Of course," Wolfe replied. "The question is, of what? Or whom?" That night, I was halfway through a roast beef sandwich and chapter 6 of a mystery novel. I was editing in my head when the phone rang. Fritz got it, passed it to Wolfe, and then knocked on the office door with the stiff solemnity of a courtroom usher. Wolfe took the receiver from me without a word. "Yes?" Pause. "Indeed." Another pause. "I see. No, do nothing until Mr. Goodwin arrives." He hung up with a thud and turned to me. "Mr. Vance," he said, "is dead." I stared. "How?" "Apparent suicide. Kramer reports it as pills. Body found in his study. Windows shut. Door locked from inside. Note on the desk." "Convenient," I muttered. Wolfe gave a snort so faint it barely made it past his nose. "Kramer believes it." "He would." Wolfe stood, which for Wolfe meant adjusting his bulk and groaning once. "You will go to the apartment, examine the room, confirm the condition of the lock, photograph the bottle, secure the note if you can. Won't Kramer object? Let him. Tell him I said the scene is artistically inconsistent." I grabbed my coat and left without asking for clarification, because I agreed. Julian Vance might have been many things, twitchy, paranoid, evasive, but suicidal. That wasn't how he'd looked. He hadn't been planning to die. He'd been planning to hide. When I got back, I handed Wolfe the items, a photo of the note, a snapshot of the pill bottle, and a copy of the coroner's preliminary log, courtesy of an officer who owed me 2 favors and a giant's ticket. Wolfe scanned the note first. It was brief, polite, contrived, like someone trying to write a suicide message from memory. "I am sorry. I failed to stop it. I am tired now. JV." Wolfe grunted. The syntax lacks urgency. The brevity is cosmetic, and the signature, though shaky, is too symmetrical. He turned to the pill bottle. "Benzodiazepine," he read. "Prescribed last month by a physician in Chelsea." He handed it back to me. "Check with the pharmacy. Confirm if it's been filled before. If not, we may infer the prescription was freshly acquired or staged." I nodded, already mentally dialing. Wolfe leaned back and steepled his fingers. A diplomat does not exit quietly. He is removed, gently or otherwise. "What now?" I asked. "Now, Archie," he said, "we prepare to ask questions in places where answers are measured, trimmed, and sold by the ounce." He closed his eyes. "But first, Fritz's duck. I require strength. Treachery is exhausting." The next morning, Wolfe summoned me to the office before breakfast, which in our world meant something was either on fire or worth interrupting Fritz's omelette schedule. When I entered, a man in his 50s with steel-rimmed glasses and a permanent squint was already seated beside Wolfe's desk. The briefcase at his feet had seen combat. Metaphorical or literal, I couldn't tell. "Archie," Wolfe said, "this is Colonel Merriman, retired, Army Intelligence, currently in the employ of a private security consulting firm. He specializes in optical surveillance." Merriman grunted a greeting without standing, which in Wolfe's world counted as efficient rather than rude. Wolfe handed him the lens, wrapped delicately in a silk handkerchief from Fritz's unused dinner service. Merriman examined it for less than a minute before speaking. "Not commercial. Definitely not recreational. Short focal length, wide aperture. This is military or counterintelligence grade. Pre-90s design. Could be Cold War surplus. Could be a one-off rebuild." "Function?" Wolfe asked. "Fixed surveillance. Concealed target framing. Transmits or stores to a nearby receiver." He handed it back with the care of someone returning a live grenade. "This," he said, "is not for catching philandering husbands. It's for catching spies." Wolfe merely nodded and said, "Thank you." The cherry on the cake had teeth. After Colonel Merriman left, Wolfe sat in silence for 5 full minutes, which meant his mind was working overtime while his lips refused to cooperate. I used the time to enjoy Fritz's substitute breakfast, smoked salmon on dark rye, and wait for my cue. When it came, Wolfe's voice was soft but measured. "Consider, Archie, the timing. Vance, a Cold War intermediary with ties to Budapest, Havana, and Geneva, books a specific room in a New York hotel, cancels, the room is reassigned, surveillance gear remains, or is planted after the switch." "Maybe someone knew he was going to cancel," I said, "and piggybacked the setup." "Or," Wolfe said, "someone else was already watching, and Vance arrived to interrupt. That gets him killed." "Yes." I leaned forward. "So he was reactivating old games? Or someone was impersonating him to do so? The Cold War never froze. It simply changed its uniform." Wolfe opened a drawer and pulled out a map of the Lucerne's upper floor, marked with guest names, utility closets, and maintenance shafts. "Vance booked room 6. Lenora Vale got it instead. The question is not just who planted the lens, but who the lens was meant to observe." "And why now?" Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Because the watchers are being watched. And that," he said, "always escalates." Back in the plant room, surrounded by several hundred orchids and 3 degrees of humidity, Wolfe spoke again, not to the flowers, but to me. "Room 6 was never meant to hold Miss Vale," he said. "It was meant for Julian Vance." "And Vance never showed," I added, "but someone still used the setup." "Which suggests two possibilities," Wolfe said. "Either Vance was drawn into the trap by someone expecting him to arrive, or Miss Vale was a decoy. Deliberate or accidental? Unknown." The Orchids, being notoriously uncooperative witnesses, offered no clarification. Wolfe adjusted a spray of pink phalaenopsis and continued. "She is famous. Visibly so. Her presence attracts attention, displaces schedules, and overrides quiet arrangements. It is conceivable that her booking was manipulated to create confusion or to bait someone else into the open. Like Vance? Or whoever replaced him." Wolfe pointed to a newspaper clipping from last year, an article on Langley International Holdings featuring a photo of Sylvia Langley, née Vance, and her husband Franklin. "Watch the daughter," he said. "Why?" "Because when men like Vance are targeted, their families are not merely collateral, they are context." He pinched a leaf and said, almost to himself, "It is no longer a matter of what Room 6 recorded. It is who was intended to be seen and who knew they would be watching." Armed with Wolfe's suspicions and a sudden urge to inspect greenery, I made a quiet return trip to the Lucerne under my favorite alias, concerned hotel consultant with clipboard and neutral tie. The lobby florist had just left, but the arrangements remained, grand, fragrant, and suspiciously symmetrical. I made my way past security, offered a few bland reassurances, and zeroed in on the bouquet nearest Room 6, a massive display of lilies, hydrangeas, and high society gilt. What caught my eye wasn't the flowers. It was the vase, thick ceramic, unusually heavy, and bolted to the mahogany stand like someone was afraid it would grow legs. I leaned in, pretending to admire the azaleas, and noticed a small wire, tan, disguised as part of the floral tape, snaking through the stems. Bingo! I glanced around, saw no cameras aimed at me, and tilted the vase just enough to see the truth. A small, embedded pinhole, no larger than a pencil lead, aimed squarely down the hallway that passed rooms 5 through 7. It wasn't watching the elevators. It wasn't watching the stairwell. It was watching that stretch of corridor. Room 6. I took photos, jotted notes, and marked the vase with my hotel consultant code, a strategically shifted lily to the left of the hydrangeas. Back at the desk, I told Penwell his centerpiece was stunning and would probably win awards. He looked pleased. I looked innocent. Both of us were lying. Next stop was the floral shop listed on the Lucerne's vendor contract, Astoria Blooms, a compact storefront that smelled like weddings and overdressed funerals. The man behind the counter was balding, pleasant, and twitchier than a squirrel near a power line. I asked about the Lucerne deliveries. He said he handled them himself. I asked about the arrangement near Room 6, and his fingers drummed the counter like Morse code for uh-oh. "We deliver standard centerpieces weekly," he said. "But this one was special." "How so?" "The hotel asked for a redesign. Bigger, heavier, different vase, different wiring inside. Said it was for structural reasons." He was lying, but it wasn't malicious. It was defensive. So I pushed. "Who told you that?" "A man, mid-40s, British accent, not hotel staff. Said he was with the board." "And he paid?" He nodded. $100 in cash. Slipped it under the wrapping. "And the hotel signed off?" He winced. "I never asked." I left him re-trimming roses with shaking hands. If his conscience had petals, they were falling off. And if the man with the British accent was who I suspected, then this whole show had been staged for someone watching from behind the fourth wall. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe the photos, florist testimony, and a receipt that conveniently didn't exist. Wolfe stared at the image of the hallway vase like it was a crossword clue made of dynamite. He tapped the photo twice, then turned to me. Julian Vance was not the instigator, he said. He was the interruption. Meaning? The surveillance was already in place. The vase, the lens, the camera. Someone was watching room 6. Vance found out. Perhaps by accident, perhaps not. He tried to reclaim the room. Failed. Then died. Or was killed. Precisely. Wolfe steepled his fingers. Mandy Horn, meanwhile, was likely the only person aside from the watcher and the watched who noticed the switch. She may have discovered the lens, or recognized the florist, or simply overheard something she shouldn't have. And Griffin? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Too confident, too calculated. He came to us not to solve the crime, but to redirect it. So who was the real target? Wolfe leaned back. That, Archie, remains to be seen. But consider this. If the watcher was watching room 6 and someone else was watching them, then we are no longer dealing with blackmail. He paused. We are dealing with warfare. And with that cheery thought, he rang for beer. The orchids remained silent. But somehow, they always knew. When you need information in a hotel that boasts more velvet than a Broadway theatre curtain, skip the concierge with the pearly smile and head straight for the elevator man with the bad back. They see everything and talk only for the right price or the right kind of smirk. Back at the Lucerne, I found my man. He was perched on his stool like a worn gargoyle, silver hair slicked back and glasses thick enough to see the sins of guests long checked out. I slid him a crisp 20, and the posture improved. Another 10, and he was suddenly fluent in midnight memory. A woman, he said, striking, dark coat, red scarf, hair pulled back tight like in a movie. She came in after midnight, used a key, went straight to room 6, alone. Sure it was room 6? I asked. I never forget a door that opens without a knock, he grinned. But she wasn't on the guest list. No, sir, I checked. And she didn't stop at the desk. Did she leave? Didn't see. Maybe the night guy did. I left the hotel with more questions than I came in with and the distinct scent of expensive perfume lingering in my coat collar. I got back to the brownstone and delivered the news to Wolfe while he was wrist-deep in a tray of Phalaenopsis hybrids. She had a key. Striking woman. Midnight visit. No record. Wolfe exhaled slowly through his nose, a method he favoured for communicating distaste without wasting vowels. I presume you noted her appearance. She could have graced a runway or robbed a safe, depending on the lighting. He didn't smile, but his eyebrow acknowledged the flourish. I suspect, Wolfe began, we are dealing with Sylvia Vance Langley. I raised one. Daughter of Julian Vance, estranged, married well. Franklin Langley, investment baron with dual interests, capital and covert influence. Yale educated, donates to both museums and think tanks. Daddy issues and spy connections. Neat. Not neat, Archie. Complicated. Sylvia is not the sort to misplace a room key, nor to use one lightly. Her appearance at the Lucerne suggests foreknowledge, not curiosity. So she's not just visiting ghosts. No, she is one. I knew what that meant in Wolfe's book. Someone who floats through doors, leaves no trail, but carries secrets like scent on silk. I grabbed my coat again. Time to meet the ghost in her natural habitat, Upper East Side, where secrets wear pearls. The Langley brownstone looked like it had opinions. Stately, symmetrical, and smug, it loomed behind wrought iron fencing that probably remembered Prohibition. Sylvia met me at the door with the kind of poise you only learn from diplomats or duelists. "Mr. Goodwin, I presume," she said, voice smooth as bone china. She led me to a sunroom where everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and something that cost 4 figures an ounce. We sat. Tea appeared. I ignored it. "You were at the Lucerne, room 6, after midnight. Why?" "I was retrieving something personal." That's vague enough to sound suspicious. "I wasn't hiding. I used a key." "Which you weren't supposed to have." A pause, just a beat, then a smile. "My father gave it to me, before he died." "You said it was personal. This got anything to do with Mandy Horn?" "No," she said. "I don't know her. This had nothing to do with her." There was a flicker then, like a tremor behind the iris. Guilt, maybe, or the memory of a lie rehearsed too many times. "And your father?" I asked. "What was so personal it needed sneaking into a hotel at midnight?" She stirred her tea. "He was an old man. He made mistakes. I was protecting his dignity." That might have sounded noble if she hadn't said it like a lawyer closing a case. I left with her words tucked in my pocket like a scented note I didn't ask for. Back home, I gave Wolfe the blow-by-blow while he sipped his beer and gave me looks like a man tracing a shadow with a ruler. "She gave you nothing," he said flatly. "She gave me a location, a motive, and a whiff of perfume I can't pronounce." "That was not a motive, Archie. That was a deflection." He leaned back, fingers interlaced across his middle. "Her visit to room 6 was premeditated. She sought to recover something her father left behind, surveillance materials perhaps, notes, data, evidence, something he had no time or courage to destroy. But she won't admit it. She cannot. To do so would confirm his treason or her complicity, possibly both. And Mandy? If Mandy saw something, if she entered the wrong room, she wasn't the target. Wolfe didn't respond. He stared out the window as if expecting Sylvia Vance Langley's conscience to come strolling up 9th Avenue. When it didn't, he reached for the bell to summon Fritz and signaled that the day's deductions had left a sour taste. It arrived in a dull grey envelope, thick stock, the kind that smells like mahogany and menace. Wolfe opened it without ceremony, glanced over the contents, and arched one imperial brow. "A letter from the firm of Garrow, Leeds and Haven, sent on behalf of concerned parties. It strongly advises we discontinue inquiries into the Lucerne matter." "No threats?" I asked. "No overt ones, but the language is, what is the current term? Loaded. Government? Almost certainly. Either state or a lesser-known cousin, perhaps an intelligence committee with an allergy to sunlight." "They're asking us to shut up." Wolfe folded the letter and placed it beside his saucer like it was part of the table setting. "I do not respond well to whispers from bureaucrats." "Are we backing off?" "No." "Good. Because I'd already made a lunch plan with the locksmith." He didn't smile. He rarely does when his blood's up, which means it's time to prepare for a move he won't announce until it's already landed. Wolfe poured a measured 2 fingers of beer and stared at the foam as if it might reveal the name of the killer. I waited. "We are past murder," he said. "We are in the province of cover-up. So we're not chasing a killer. We're poking at a chessboard." "Precisely." He took a long sip. "I dislike provocation, Archie. It is inelegant, but effective. You want to smoke them out. I want someone to believe the truth is about to be revealed, then observe their panic. Panic can be messy. It can also be illuminating." Fritz entered with a tray of duck confit sandwiches, and Wolfe waved him off with a flick. That's when I knew we were really in it. "So what's the move?" "You will, politely, revisit the locksmith." and impolitely, if required. He stood. Wolfe stood, mind you, and paced 3 full steps before sitting again. That was his version of a somersault. He didn't need to say it, but I got the memo. The game had changed, and somewhere in that brownstone or boardroom, someone was sweating in silk. The locksmith remembered me. Hard to forget a guy who once talked him into opening a door with a licorice stick. This time, I had actual money. And a question. Room 6, the Lucerne. Duplicate key request. Ring a bell? He rubbed his chin. Yeah. Came through 3 days before the lady died. Name? He checked the logbook, then looked up slow. S. Langley. Signature match? Pretty close. Looked official. So Sylvia had the key before Mandy checked in, which shifted the timeline and the motive in one neat snap. I left him with a 20 and the advice to forget he ever spoke to me. Wolfe was going to love this. And maybe, just maybe, someone else was going to hate it. Wolfe once said, "Alias is the first refuge of the guilty." And while I'd heard more poetic takes on the subject, I couldn't disagree. Especially not when the ink on Carl Grantham's guest ledger matched the hand of Cal Griffin, our smooth-talking producer with a square jaw and a crooked past. A phone call to Danny Lucy, an old friend from the Boston PD who owed me more favors than I had suits, paid off within the hour. Lucy confirmed that Cal Griffin had indeed stayed at the Windsor Arms 3 months ago, right under the name Carl Grantham. Charming, right? Even checked in with a bow tie and a smile. But the cherry on top wasn't the alias. It was what Danny muttered just before hanging up. That same week, some finance whale raised hell, claimed someone bugged his room. Hotel hushed it fast. So now we had 2 things, a pseudonym and a pissed-off target. I hung up and reported to Wolfe, who was up in the plant rooms communing with a stubborn vanilla orchid. He didn't blink when I told him. "Continue," he said, "before the camouflage dries." And with that, we were on the scent of something nastier than perfume and wiretaps. Back in the brownstone, Wolfe ordered me to retrieve a sheaf of Cal Griffin's old press releases, the kind publicists send out when they want the world to think their client discovered fire and charm in the same week. From a manila folder that smelled like dust and flattery, Wolfe produced 3 different samples of Griffin's signature across the years, once as a producer of avant-garde theatre in Chicago, again as a consultant on a failed Parisian film festival, and most recently as our charming devil at the Lucerne. He didn't need a microscope. Wolfe's eyes, though thick behind glass, saw ink like a hawk sees mice. "Observe, Archie." He tapped the final signature. "The slant is inconsistent. The tail of the G here tightens unnaturally. It's mimicry under pressure. This is a practiced forgery, not a natural evolution. So Griffin forged himself, in essence, or," he said, pausing to lift his glass of beer, "he's been playing so many roles for so long he's forgotten which one is his." I thought that poetic, in a bleak kind of way. But Wolfe wasn't done. "Handwriting," he added, "is the slow confession of the soul." And it looked like Griffin's soul had a few secrets inked in. Back at Lenora Vale's theatre, a chandeliered nest of velvet, sweat, and last-minute line flubs, I cornered a wardrobe assistant named Jilly Greer. She was ironing something gauzy and expensive when I dropped Griffin's name. Her hands stopped mid-press. "You mean the guy Mandy saw at the Lucerne?" she said, glancing around like someone might be listening. "Yeah." She freaked. "Freaked?" "She was walking with me. We were early. He passed us by the lobby elevators and bam! Her whole face went blank. Then she turned to stone." "Did she say anything?" Jilly bit her lip. Just, I know him from somewhere. Real soft. Then she said, somewhere I shouldn't. Gave me chills. It gave me something too. A memory, faint but prickling. Mandy had been on edge that whole trip. I'd chalked it up to travel nerves and the pressure of dressing America's aging stage darling. But this? It smelled like something older, deeper. I gave Jilly a thank you peck on the cheek, professional courtesy, and left her to her ironing board. Back on the street, I called Wolfe from a payphone. His answer was a simple hum. Mandy hadn't just seen Griffin. She'd remembered something. And remembering can be dangerous. Wolfe's eyebrows were at half-mast, which, in Wolfian terms, meant the case was starting to annoy him. When I walked in and handed over the details of Mandy's reaction, plus the alias revelation, he gave the faintest grunt and reached for his second bottle of beer. "Archie, we are dealing with a man of theatrical instincts and criminal practicality," he said. "A rare and volatile combination." "You're talking about Griffin?" "I am, and I believe I now grasp the contours of his enterprise." He motioned for me to sit, which I did, mostly because I didn't feel like dodging the next monologue standing. "Consider," Wolfe began, "a network of luxury hotel suites, discreet staff, pliable bellhops. Add to that miniature surveillance equipment planted behind floral arrangements or inside light fixtures. Invite the right guests, diplomats, executives, financiers, and present them with temptations. Women, men, or simply privacy. Then wait. And record," I added. "Indeed. Then comes the business model. Identify the most vulnerable and extract payment in exchange for silence. It is not a novel crime, but it requires care, connections, and an unscrupulous technician. Vance may have discovered it, perhaps even intended to dismantle it, and Mandy was collateral." He nodded. "Her death may not have been planned, but it was convenient. For Griffin." I sat back. The air in the office was suddenly thick. Wolfe glanced at the window. "We will corner him, Archie, but carefully. Blackmailers," he said softly, "deal in shadows and bite when dragged into the light. It's one thing to surprise a man at breakfast. It's another to do it while he's buttering a croissant with all the poise of a debutante." I showed up at Griffin's hotel suite unannounced. He opened the door in a tailored shirt and an expression that said, this had better be about business. "Morning," I said. "Or should I say, bonjour, Mr. Grantham?" That did it. His eyes didn't widen. They twitched, a tiny tick at the corner, like his brain had slapped the panic button before his mouth caught up. "I beg your pardon?" "Windsor Arms, Boston, 3 months ago. Your John Hancock was on the guest log, unless someone else has your flair for descending G's." Griffin chuckled, the kind that doesn't quite reach the throat. "You've been busy. Let's call it curious. I assume you have a point?" "Oh, several. Starting with a certain blackmail victim at that same hotel and ending with a dead wardrobe girl who recognized you." That shut him up. He didn't confess. That would have been too easy. But the colour drained from his cheeks and the croissant started to sag in his hand. I didn't need more. The rat had felt the trap's teeth. That evening, the brownstone was quiet. Too quiet. Which in Wolfe's case usually means an idea is brewing that'll either crack the case or get me punched. He sat at his desk, fingers templed, eyes half-lidded, not asleep, but hibernating in thought. When I briefed him on Griffin's reaction, he nodded once and murmured, "Satisfactory." Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a crisp envelope. "This," he said, is your invitation. You will deliver it to Mr. Griffin." I took it. The handwriting was Wolfe's, heavy and exact. "It's not a dinner party, is it?" "Hardly. You will tell him that a third party, unnamed of course, has obtained a duplicate of the Windsor Arms footage. Inform him that said footage is for sale. Name a price high enough to unsettle him." I raised an eyebrow. "You want me to pose as a blackmailer?" "Not pose. Imply. Let his fear do the rest. He will make contact with the true accomplice or attempt flight. Either way, we watch. And if he bites, we spring." He folded his hands. "Archie, blackmailers are predators. They rely on shame, silence, and surprise. But shame can be resisted. Silence can be broken." He leaned forward slightly. "Surprise," he said, "is mine to control." I nodded, slipping the envelope into my coat pocket. "Fair warning," I said, heading for the door. "If he throws that cross on at me again, I'm billing you for dry cleaning." The only thing tighter than the air in Wolfe's office that afternoon was Cal Griffin's jaw. And he wasn't the only one clenching something. We had them all assembled. Wolfe's idea, of course, not mine. Personally, I prefer suspects spaced out like bad art at a gallery. But Wolfe wanted them in one room, to witness revelation in its entirety. That meant a full house. Lenora Vale perched stiffly near the globe, Sylvia Langley draped in offended elegance near the bookshelves, Cal Griffin stewing in the red chair like a roast that knew what was coming, the hotel manager sweating into his collar, and Kramer standing by the windows with his arms folded like a disappointed uncle. The FBI liaison, a sharp-chinned woman named Barrow with a clipped voice and zero tolerance for pleasantries, occupied the chair usually reserved for visiting publishers. Wolfe didn't like her much. She didn't like anyone at all. Wolfe sat behind his desk like a smug Buddha, yellow silk handkerchief peeking from his breast pocket, lips set in a line that promised someone was about to regret showing up. He lit a cigar with enough ceremony to qualify as ritual. Then, slowly, deliberately, he spoke. "I am not given to theatrics," Wolfe began, which, considering the spotlight he'd just built for himself, made me lift a brow. "But the circumstances compel clarity," he continued, "and clarity requires audience." Nobody moved. Even Kramer kept quiet, though I saw his fingers twitching for a cigar he didn't have. Wolfe tapped the blotter with his index finger. The death of Mr. Lawrence Vance was not suicide. It was, at minimum, murder by manipulation, possibly more. The hotel manager let out a small cough. Griffin shifted. "3 events matter most," Wolfe went on. 1. A reservation was altered. Room 6, originally assigned to a certain Mr. Grantham, was reassigned without proper authorization. 2. That room contained an optical device far beyond civilian access. And 3. That device was aimed not at a vanity mirror, but at the window across the alley. Barrow leaned forward. "Which window?" "Room 9, Wolfe replied. "A suite rented under a fictitious name, paid in cash. We have reason to believe it hosted meetings of an illicit nature, possibly blackmail, certainly leverage." Griffin opened his mouth, closed it again. "And Mr. Vance?" Barrow pressed. Wolfe's lips curled faintly. He saw the bait, not the trap. And now Wolfe would show them the teeth. Wolfe allowed the tension to steep for a beat, like a good cup of Fritz's Darjeeling. "Let us consider intention," he said. "The camera, masquerading as a candelabrum, was not placed to capture the movements of Miss Vale, as some speculated. It was angled specifically to peer across the alley into room 9, and the timing of its placement was not arbitrary." He turned his gaze toward Griffin, who had gone noticeably pale beneath his tan. Mr. Griffin, also known, albeit temporarily, as Carl Grantham, had scheduled a quiet meeting in room 9 that same weekend. A private rendezvous with someone who had leverage over him, the sort of leverage captured best not with lawyers, but with film. Griffin laughed dryly. "That's a stretch, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe ignored him. The camera was intended to document a handoff, or perhaps a betrayal. Someone in Griffin's circle wished to reverse the balance, to record evidence of blackmail or perhaps entrapment. Barrow nodded once. "And the room change?" "Precisely. The plan required Griffin to be in room 9 and the camera in room 6. But someone, possibly our enterprising hotel manager, reassigned room 6 without understanding the significance." The manager opened his mouth, shut it, opened it again. There was a VIP check-in. Lenora Vale's team requested the suite." "Unintended consequences," Wolfe murmured. "Miss Vale received the surveillance setup, unaware. Mr. Griffin arrived to find his theatre of secrets hijacked, and Mr. Vance," he leaned back, "was in the wrong room at the right time. There remains," Wolfe said softly, "the matter of Miss Horne." Sylvia Langley flinched, just slightly. Griffin stared straight ahead. Barrow scribbled something in a leather-bound notebook. "Mandy Horne, a wardrobe assistant with more observational capacity than some detectives I know." Wolfe didn't look at Kramer, but he didn't have to. Recognized Mr. Griffin from a previous encounter. Boston. A hotel. A scandal involving surveillance. Griffin finally spoke, voice low and dangerous. "You have no proof of that." "I have testimony from someone who was with her when she saw you," Wolfe said, "and her reaction was not one of coincidence. It was recognition, the kind that unsettles the soul." "She never told me anything," Sylvia whispered, a little too quickly. "Indeed, perhaps she said too little. But she saw something else. The room switch. The equipment. She helped unpack it." Lenora Vale looked stunned. "She never mentioned because she was weighing what she knew, and someone else was weighing her." I felt it then, that subtle chill Wolfe could summon when the pieces began to lock in. "She became a liability," Wolfe concluded, "and in blackmail, as in espionage, liabilities are swiftly removed." Barrow nodded grimly, and Griffin's hands curled into fists, just out of view. Wolfe leaned forward just a touch, which for him was the equivalent of standing on a rooftop and shouting. "Mr. Vance made one critical mistake," he said, voice low and sonorous. "He assumed he could meddle without consequence." Barrow narrowed her eyes. "Meddle how?" "He recognized the lens setup for what it was," Wolfe replied. "Military-grade optics, possibly familiar from his own intelligence work. He deduced its purpose, not surveillance of Miss Vale, but a sting operation on room 9, and then he recognized who the intended subject was." Griffin's eyes flickered. "He tried to act," Wolfe went on. "That night he returned to room 6. Mandy Horne was there. We believe he tried to warn her, to retrieve the setup, perhaps dismantle it. But someone was faster." He glanced at Kramer. "A key to room 6 was found in Griffin's jacket. Not one issued to him. A duplicate." Kramer growled. "We checked with the front desk. Only 3 master copies were made. 1 is missing." "Vance," Wolfe said calmly, "walked into a trap meant for someone else, and paid for his integrity with a staged suicide and a broken neck." It was a quiet moment. The kind right before someone either confesses or bolts. Griffin had been doing a decent job of playing the indignant victim, but under Wolfe's crosshairs, he started to look like a man trying to bluff his way out of quicksand with a poker face made of cardboard. "You're reaching," he muttered, chin high. "You have no real evidence." "Only the lens," Wolfe said. "The key, the fake name, the prior incident in Boston, the room reassignment, the fact that you were seen entering room 9 at 11:03 p.m. and Miss Horne's recognition of your face." I'll give him this. Griffin had guts, or at least the kind of misplaced courage that gets you a 10-year sentence and a footnote in a book no one reads. "People make mistakes," he said. "A hotel employee misassigns a room. A girl misremembers a guest. It doesn't make me a murderer." Wolfe's lip twitched. "Then perhaps you'll explain why you checked in under the name Carl Grantham, the same alias used in a separate surveillance incident in Boston last year, or why your room 6 key had no record in the hotel system." Griffin opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Kramer stepped forward like a boulder getting curious. "You shoved Vance out the window. Tell me I'm wrong." "I didn't touch him," Griffin exploded. "I didn't kill anyone. I didn't—" Wolfe held up a hand. "No need for confession. You've already made one, by omission." Griffin slumped in the chair. The room was quiet enough to hear Fritz's soup spoons clinking from the kitchen. Wolfe exhaled through his nose, a slow, almost indulgent gesture, the kind he reserved for concluding chapters, brandy, or particularly pleasing orchids. "Mr. Griffin was not merely the target of blackmail," he said. "He was also the originator of a counterplot, a trap to reverse leverage and silence his pursuer. That much is clear." He steepled his fingers. "Miss Horne, by accident or intuition, uncovered too much. Mr. Vance, by honor or guilt, intervened, and for that both became disposable." Barrow said nothing, but her pen had stopped moving. "Griffin's motive," Wolfe continued, "was layered. Ego, fear, espionage, perhaps treason. His facade crumbled not because of justice, but because of exposure." Kramer crossed his arms. "We'll see how he holds up when the feds start turning screws." Wolfe nodded once. "Indeed." He looked at Barrow. "You'll find what you need in the surveillance logs, the room assignments, the missing key, and Miss Horne's notes. I suggest discretion." Barrow rose. "You'll have our thanks, and your silence." "Thank you," Wolfe said, with only the faintest trace of a smirk. "Archie, see them out." I stood. Griffin didn't meet my eyes as I opened the door, but Sylvia Langley did. And what I saw there made me wonder if this case had really just ended. And I had a hunch Wolfe already knew the answer. Kramer's handshake is something like a forced truce at the end of a barroom brawl, gritty, begrudging, and without the faintest trace of pleasure. He extended his paw across Wolfe's desk like it had a grenade pin in the middle. Wolfe, to his credit, touched it briefly with a fingertip and withdrew as though he'd just shaken hands with an unwashed bassoonist. "That's one hell of a mess you cleaned up," Kramer grunted. "You ever think of letting me in on these things before the storm hits?" Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "I thought you preferred to avoid amateur conjecture." Kramer snorted. "I'd rather avoid another body crashing through a window on my shift." He jerked a thumb toward Griffin, who was now cuffed and staring at the carpet like it had just personally betrayed him. "I'm taking him downtown. The feds will want first crack. And you'd better believe Langley's boys in grey are watching this one." Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "We have no objections." Kramer gave me a look, the kind a man gives a raccoon who keeps solving the trash lid puzzle. "Next time, you call me first. Got it?" "Next time," I said with a grin, "I'll let you pick the candelabra." That earned me a grunt. Not quite a compliment, but close enough. Griffin paused at the door, his hands cuffed, his collar crooked. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret. Or maybe just the last gasp of a man watching his story fold without an ending. He turned to Wolfe. "You don't understand. I didn't." Wolfe raised a hand. It wasn't sharp, or loud, or cruel, just final. "You lied too often to deserve the truth. That was all. No flourish, no lecture, just that single, cold, lacquered sentence that dropped like a curtain." Griffin stood there another half-second before Kramer gave him a nudge that said the rest. As the door shut, I watched Griffin's reflection vanish from the glass like steam off a mirror. I knew he had more to say. They always do. But Wolfe had already closed the book on that chapter, and you don't keep reading once the period's been placed. I was half hoping Sylvia Langley would swan out of the room with a clever farewell and a waft of imported perfume. What she did instead was linger, just a step behind the closing door, fingers brushing the mahogany edge like it might tell her what to say. "I'd like a word," she said softly, "with Mr. Wolfe, alone." Wolfe didn't object, which meant I took the hint and gave them space. I relocated to the archway near the bookshelves, far enough to pretend I wasn't eavesdropping, close enough to read tone and posture like chapter headings. She stood with her arms folded, not defensive, but preserved. Wolfe didn't rise naturally, but inclined his head just enough to acknowledge that this was not performance, but epilogue. I didn't catch every word. I wasn't meant to. But I caught the weight in her silence. The part where she didn't apologize for hiring us, or for what the case had cost, or for what it hadn't saved. She left a moment later, her heels quiet, her eyes unreadable. "She didn't say thank you," I said. "No," Wolfe replied, "but she meant it." And sometimes that lands louder than the word itself. Back upstairs, the orchids were behaving. It was Wolfe's version of an after-party. Silence, humidity, and a small pair of pruning shears as delicate as a bishop's blessing. He hovered over a rare Paphiopedilum like it had recently insulted him and now required judgment and mercy in equal measure. Fritz hovered nearby with a cup of coffee, wearing the contented expression of a man whose kitchen had been restored to pre-homicide levels of calm. Wolfe trimmed a yellowed petal with surgical care and muttered, "Fertilized deceit and decayed ambition." Fritz tilted his head. "Sir?" "This case," Wolfe said. "It had the stench of something meant to grow, but left too long in shadow." He didn't elaborate, and Fritz didn't ask. That's part of Fritz's genius, knowing when not to poke the bear, especially when the bear has just uprooted a conspiracy and solved a diplomatic murder with one eyebrow raised. "Dinner in 20 minutes, Fritz said gently. Wolfe nodded once, eyes on the blossoms. I watched from the doorway. It struck me that some cases are like orchids, rare, meticulous, too fragile to bloom all the way before someone snaps the stem, and this one had come close. I stayed downstairs after Wolfe retired to the greenhouse again. There's something sacred about the first few quiet moments after a case wraps, like the air hasn't realized the tension's over and is still holding its breath. I cracked open a cold bottle of beer and dropped into my desk chair, letting my legs stretch out like they were done with diplomacy and death for the day. The candelabra was still there, faint wax rings marking where it had once proudly stood in room 9. Now it looked almost apologetic, like a guest who showed up uninvited and stayed too long. I thought about Mandy Horn and her cassettes, Griffin's flinch when Wolfe named the alias, Vance's polished shoes poking out beneath the curtain. It all felt like it had happened in some parallel universe, one where secrets paid in cash and guilt got thrown out of a window. And that lens, the cursed little eye that never saw what it wanted to. We dusted it, bagged it, catalogued it. Wolfe had it locked in his drawer now, useless and blind. Some things are meant to shine. Gold, glass, names on doors. And they don't. Some lights never light, and the worst ones are the ones that flicker once, just once, so you believe in them, then vanish. I took a long sip of beer and didn't toast anyone. The buzzer went off, Wolfe's little electric chime that meant, "Stop your philosophizing and bring the man his beer." I rose with the enthusiasm of a pensioned bloodhound and made my way to the kitchen. Fritz had left the tray ready, naturally. A tall glass, slightly chilled, and the exact coaster Wolfe favoured, the one with the tiny faded orchid stamp no one was allowed to question. As I climbed the stairs, the house felt heavy and still, the kind of still that comes not from absence but from aftermath. Outside, I heard the usual city hum, buses sighing, someone yelling 4 floors down, a saxophone doing its best impression of heartbreak. All very New York, all exactly right. I opened Wolfe's door and set the tray beside his armchair. He didn't look up. He was writing something in his orchid journal, his pen moving with the grace of a man who knew his words would outlive most people. On the far wall, the drawer was shut. Inside it, the lens sat in darkness, retired from lies, truths, and everything between. Another case closed, another silence earned, and the orchids, smug as ever, just kept blooming. Justice, in Wolfe's world, rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes instead in the quiet rearrangement of truth, a lens found in the wrong drawer, a name that didn't belong, a light that failed to shine when it mattered most. What began as a false suicide and a shuffled room key unraveled into something far colder, ambition rotting beneath diplomacy, and love bent by blackmail into silence. In the end, everyone left with something lost, except the orchids, who never lie. Do you believe the killer truly had a choice? Or was it fate dressed in desperation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth